Good morning, everyone. Guess we'll get started. My name is Mark Ryland. I'm the Chief Architect for the Public Sector team at Amazon Web Services. Very happy to have you here. Very excited to have you at the conference. I hope you've enjoyed the last day and the couple of great keynotes, great customer stories. We're here today to talk to some more great customers. I'll introduce my panelists here, who are both senior leaders in organizations that have made some big moves to AWS, and we'll share a bit about that journey, but our focus today will be about culture of innovation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that once we do the intros, but I'll pass the baton now to Saman Farr, who's the Senior Vice President of Technology at FINRA. Saman, would you like to do an intro about yourself and a little bit about what FINRA is doing with AWS?
Sure. Maybe just before doing that, who here is doing something on AWS? It helps maybe us to calibrate the, all right.
That's half the audience.
Half the audience. Okay. And the rest of you are cloud curious?
Raise your hand if you're curious about cloud.
Okay, all right. That's to calibrate it. So maybe a few words about FINRA, and then that helps put in context what it is that we're doing on AWS. We're a financial regulator. We receive, among other things, feeds from various stock exchanges and trading venues in the US, knit it all together to create a picture of what's going on, and then do analytics and surveillance looking for fraud, among other things that we do. So the volumes on these things are quite high. We get up to 75 billion records a day in. And these, where we have, 4 years ago, we started a program to migrate to AWS. And we used it really as a kind of a Manhattan project, really to transform the culture, the way we work, and our technology base at the same time. This finished a year ago for these market regulation systems that I'm speaking of, which is 90% of our data footprint. And we've been in production on all of that stuff for over a year now. And that's, I'm responsible for software development and infrastructure at FINRA.
And Jay Littlepage, who's the VP of Infrastructure and Operations at Digital Globe. Jay, would you like to give us a quick overview?
Digital Globe is probably a company that many of you haven't heard of, but next time you open up your laptop and you look at Google Maps and it's a particularly good-looking image, look down at the watermark and you'll probably see that it's Digital Globe imagery. We're a 25-year-old company. We are a commercial company that flies high-resolution satellites, which is pretty cool stuff. We've been doing that for a long time. We've accumulated a very large volume of imagery. It totals, fully uncompressed in its final form, 100 petabytes. We're collecting 80 terabytes a day from the satellites. It's about 10 petabytes a year. So it's a data management challenge for us internally, and it's a opportunity for us in terms of the market, because historically our customers have been government agencies who have consumed the imagery itself for various purposes. And increasingly what is happening, because there's just so much and it's so high resolution, that our biggest customers are asking us to extract information out of it. What's the inside the image, more so than what's the image itself. And so that's turning us from a provider of very large images. One high resolution image could be 35 gig by itself, into a big data company in many ways. From an IT standpoint, historically we've done this all in-house. We started our journey about 3 years ago. Our big data business has always been on AWS, but the imagery has always been, as our CTO and founder says, in jail. So I guess I run the jail and the warden.
On-prem equals in jail.
Yeah. So it's hard to get that much imagery, that dense of imagery, into a place where it can actually be useful. And so our big jump into this from an IT standpoint was moving very aggressively with partnership in partnership with AWS to move all that imagery. And so we started with snowballs about a year ago, and we shipped off and kind of said goodbye to a big white truck, the snowmobile, about a month ago, with every image ever taken in the history of Digital Globe, and it's currently in the process of getting ingested. So that in itself was a pretty innovative effort, and it's now putting us in a position where we are now transforming from a culture standpoint. Fun stuff.
Thanks for those intros. So the premise of this panel, there's a couple of ideas I think that are going to permeate this panel, and I want to start off by sort of putting those out. We'll have a little bit of dialogue at the beginning, but we definitely want to engage with the audience and get your feedback and your questions as well. So one premise is that the tool shapes the tool maker to some extent. So we have all this cool technology, it's very innovative technology, but what's interesting also is that along with that, accompanying that, driving it, or in some ways being driven by that, is business innovation, is change in business culture and the way that people go about doing their business. So we want to kind of discuss the interrelation between those things, how the kind of sort of dual causality, I would say, between the sort of innovation in the technology and innovation in business culture. That's one theme. Another theme is from great customers like these two companies, we get super valuable feedback, and that drives our innovation. So Amazon Web Services is trying to be very responsive to customer needs. We want to talk a bit about how we are as a partner and how well we're able to respond to the needs of our customers. So let's kind of start with that first theme and then get your opening thoughts on that. In terms of, along with the technical changes going along with the cloud journey, talk a little bit about the changes in business culture and how innovation is either fostered, inhibited, how that changes through the changes in the technology base. Why don't you start, Saman? Sure.
I mean, there's a few aspects to this which might be interesting to people here. In terms of the technology base and what does it do for innovation, one of the aspects that we used heavily was the ability to automate things that are typically done in this, more routine-based processes that are done in technology. So, well, why is that a cloud thing? Somebody might ask. Well, it is a cloud thing. And use of AWS helps that a lot because so much of the infrastructure is programmable and API accessible. So it lends itself much more to automation. So when we looked at going to, taking our platforms and we rewrote them on AWS, it wasn't a lift and shift. And one of the key reasons, there were several, I mean, there's performance and all those kinds of things, but one of the key ones was we didn't want to take our processes that were in-house and move those to AWS, because with that move comes you're moving your processes, you're moving all your inefficiencies, and you're moving the same cost structure also. So we had a very concerted effort to rethink what our processes do and move them to AWS and re-implement them on AWS. So just to get to the point about the creativity dimension of it, so what we did is we took, essentially the mantra was if there's a ticket-based process somewhere, that's grounds for automation. We shouldn't have technologists doing rote things as part of the normal day-to-day business process. Instead, we should have technologists writing programs that automate those things that just run in them and with the right approvals and so on and so forth. So what that did is it changed the demographics it shifted the emphasis of the workforce from an operations-centric, or maybe not centric, but operations-heavy emphasis on all the people that keep the lights on and run the processes and so on and so forth, to a software development center of gravity. It's just a change in demographics that happens. So then with that comes a lot of other kinds of things, because now we're attracting a lot of, we're very active in the communities that we have development centers, like in Rockville, Maryland, so in the DC area and in the New York area, in recruiting. So we're recruiting different categories of people and profiles of people. So we do hackathons, we do internal create-a-thons, there's a lot we need to do to attract those people, and also then once you have creative people, to harvest the information and the knowledge and make it something that they're actually producing. So that's kind of tying it back to that simple aspect of, if you're automating, your dollars are now going to a different type of workforce. I think that is one of the strong ones. Then another aspect, which I won't dwell on, is the ability to be more agile and have much more rapid projects and so forth. We can talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, we'll follow up on that.
Yeah, just maybe picking up on that point. We started this journey, like I said, 3 years ago, and I think that the thing that we moved very quickly on was moving from a very waterfall-oriented environment. After all, we build satellites. That's a waterfall project, to a very heavily focused, scaled agile environment. And so our last satellite, Worldview 4, which went up in November, was built, and the ground system that's flying it was built as a completely new architecture using agile methodology, really involving the business. And so that was a big change, and it was actually a lot of tension, because we sort of had to couple those two environments together, particularly with something where there are no degrees of failure to get that done. And so the agility aspect of that brought the business and the IT organization together in ways that really hadn't happened before. And so that was one aspect of it. The other one, though, was the move into AWS itself. Took a little bit longer than we would have liked for a variety of reasons. And so I've heard a number of the keynote speakers talk about the Department of No. I think for a lot of reasons we felt like the Department of No, because we have a lot of capacity in-house, but it's constrained capacity, and a lot of the things that we might want to do are temporal. There's something that's happening on the planet that we might want to address, and if we can address it, not only are we helping our customer accomplish something that's very important to them, but we're, as a for-profit company, making money. And we had to say no to a lot of things, because the imagery that was at the basis of that was locked away on tape. We had limited processing capabilities. We had to deliver it someplace, which was increasingly AWS. And so we were missing out on a lot of opportunities. And so a year ago, we decided to kind of flip things around and take that constraint out of the process. And so in this overall migration, and we are building fit-for-purpose new systems to replace 15 years of code that has gotten us to where we are today, we led with data. And so the first thing to move to AWS was the data. We're actually still flying the satellite in my data center, but we're producing the imagery to AWS. It's immediately available for all customer use cases. And so now every time we have a question, it's yes, and it's a do more. And it feels, it's actually pretty fun to be able to push the business and allow them to basically go out there and look at these use cases that they had actually programmed themselves to not even ask for, which is a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. I know, Saman, we've talked about in the past where another example of the kind of interplay between the technology and the business is something as simple as a budget or a cost model, where teams are now liberated to say, look, if you can save money on infrastructure, you can spend more money on labor, or vice versa. You have this kind of a flexibility that before there was no way to make those kind of interchanges or trade-offs. And another, I want you to comment on that, but another thing that I find fascinating, I was talking to like a software development manager a few months ago, he said, for the first time in my career, my software engineers talk about cost. They've never talked about cost before, because it was always just something like they were provided this stuff that they were supposed to work with. But now when they do design work, they think about, hey, what's the most cost-efficient way to build the system that I want to build? Because now that's part of how they think about design work. So maybe you guys could reflect on that and comment on some of those issues.
Sure. So maybe probably a fair number of you work in large organizations. Yeah, I would think. So, then the typical way that IT projects are done as viewed by a manager is that there's a budget for a project, it's so much money to do certain things, and that's a labor budget. And then there's a non-labor aspect for infrastructure and so forth, and usually I think most of you would see it as an allocation. And it's not really clear how it comes up, or somebody somewhere comes up with an allocation and this is what it is. So as you're managing costs, you're typically optimizing around the labor budget and saying, well, I have so many programmers, I need them for 9 months, but maybe I need them for 12, and that's the game. What we did is, because when we, at the very beginning, when we went to AWS, we made a very conscious decision that money is money. So if somebody is running a project, yes, there's a labor budget, and there's also a non-labor budget, which is the infrastructure, the AWS, whatever it is that they think they're going to use. And the manager has the flexibility and the freedom to move funds between these, which is kind of opens up dimensions now. Because from an organizational point of view, it's money. I mean, it doesn't really matter. So what does that do then? So it allows optimizations to happen, where if we can make this faster and this better and that, this and that, maybe we can then keep the programmers around for longer on that project. Or we really need to get this out fast, and we'll have some inefficiencies in the code, but and have a higher non-labor budget on this, but enable to, for example, to expedite the time to market, and then later come back and optimize it. But there's a series of trade-offs now that the manager gets, which they didn't have before. And it's with that comes responsibility and not blowing the budget and so on and so forth. So when we implemented it, we gave a lot of help, really, of people that were assigned to help out, help people get through that thinking process, especially for the first 1 or 2 project deliveries that they were doing, to know how to manage that and to balance that and not get in trouble and see the power of that. So that was kind of a big thing. And that provides a certain sense of creative autonomy and operational decision-making and levers that places didn't have. The other side of it, or the second benefit of this then, is it allows us to track costs at a very direct level as attributed to projects for their delivery and operationally to business units and who's using what. And that itself is, it's enlightening. I think for business leaders to be able to see, well, what are we using? I mean, because it was always, it's kind of traditionally it's below the line and buried. So then that helps foster discussions around, well, is this a worthwhile project to do, or is that one over there more worthwhile? So these things open up quite a bit if they're leveraged appropriately.
Yeah. Is that a similar experience that you've had, Jay?
Yes and no. We've got, I don't think we're quite far along, and I would not say that our developers are talking about costs quite yet. We are, like a lot of IT organizations, like Simon talked about, we are a cost center. We do allocate our costs out when we can't actually attribute it directly to a particular project or product, which we're doing more of. But we've got one anti-pattern, which is actually an inhibitor to our ability to innovate, and that is we have 2 colors of money. One is operating capital, OpEx, or operating expenses. The other one's capital. And being a capital-intensive business that is used to long projects like putting satellites in the air that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, there's refined processes for both, and they're not transferable. So $1 of OpEx does not easily become $1 of CapEx.
We talked to a lot of organizations that are thinking or considering or moving into cloud, and that is a transformation that it has to take place, really.
Because that goes pretty deep into your accounting systems and everything else, right? I mean, it's not like an easy bit to flip.
Well, and the thing that's really interesting that's happening now with AWS is we're actually breaking that anti-pattern down because we are reducing our capital spend in order to create operating expenses. And we actually paid for our move of our imagery into AWS by kind of giving back to the company in the budget cycle the capital we would spend in order to fund the operating
cost avoidance
expense.
model.
Yeah. So what's happening now is the imagery itself is a shared asset, and so I pay for that directly. It kind of gets allocated out like anything else, but any compute that anybody is doing on that is charged directly to their cost center through the account structure we have in AWS. And so the anti-pattern, the new anti-pattern is, what's this bill for? Well, I didn't budget for that. It used to be free. It's like, no, it wasn't free.
Definitely showing all the costs.
But it's ultimately going to drive the right behavior, but it's going to we have to go through this budget cycle to get into next year's budget cycle so people can actually use this as a baseline and budget appropriately.
Yeah, increased transparency is a great theme here. We come across this all the time. We have a customer who's a state university, and we're talking about total cost of ownership, and we're talking about different factors. And they said, "Oh, well, electricity's free. It's in our state charter. We don't pay for electricity." And at the university level, we're like, "Well, somebody's paying for that. Maybe you should be thinking about conserving it, even if you're not paying for it." But let's face it: as human beings, we don't think about things that don't have a direct impact on us, or at least not very much. So this is very healthy, I think, from a business perspective, to have people very conscious of actual costs and not have things sort of buried or hidden, or so that's been a really interesting change. What about risk taking? Innovation often is associated with risk taking and being willing to fail, for example. Is that something that you see, a change that's occurring in terms of the way your organizations are evolving?
Well, we have a slightly different view of traditionally risk, well, something bad, right? I mean, that's why it's called risk. And we don't want to go there because if you open that door, I mean, it's the edge of the earth.
Yeah, there be dragons.
Yeah, you're going to fall off if you go too fast off that edge. And but in reality, I mean, if you take the stigma out of it, what it boils down to is large project failures. And I think a lot of this thinking comes from the era of, with 10,000 people building the software pyramids, and then, pyramid didn't meet at the top or whatever it was defined as failure. And so that's where that thinking comes from. And the movement over the last 10 years to Agile addresses this to some degree, but I think it's a cultural aspect to be able to send a few people off into the darkness with a flashlight to do the POC, to make sure that it works, and it doesn't cost very much. And if a few people is a lot for an organization, well, half a person can go off in the darkness. So the concept of risk starts to evaporate when trying something doesn't have any real scary consequences. And then by the time it kind of comes to be a project proposal, there's a little version of it kind of working, and actually somebody sort of found it useful. And there are a lot of arguments that happen where, well, our projects don't lend themselves to that because we're this way or that way, we're highly regulated, or we're not, or we have a lot of things to do beneath the iceberg before we can actually show the first little button of value on a screen or something. And I think in reality, and I've certainly heard a lot of those kinds of things, but let's take analytic systems as an example, which is one that we deal with a lot. If the data is available, subject to the right security and all of that type of thing and access controls, and a project does not have to go through the burden of cleaning and doing all the data engineering and sourcing the data, and that's the expensive parts. But if that data is available, and then a very lightweight project can do some machine learning and some this and that, well, this sort of works. And do a very inexpensive proof of concept, it takes a lot of the risks out. Right. So I think it's to the degree that organizations can look at what types of projects they do and say, well, what would be required for this to be a couple of people part-time and on weekends could do something. I think it changes the risk equation dramatically. And the aspect of AWS that helps out with this, which is, I think, a first order enabler, is the ability to have, I've used for analytic systems, and we can use other ones too, one is the hardware is there, obviously, so there isn't that CapEx required to do a big processing or anything like that. You could dial it up, dial it down. But then the platforms also enable a programming at a higher level. So you can have a couple of Lambda functions that do something. You can have, there's an RDS instance, it's easy to do. So a couple of people can do a lot without all that support staff behind them on a pay-as-you-go basis by using the platforms. That changes the risk profile completely on projects.
Yep.
At least if you can exploit it, it does.
Risk and risk-taking experimentation in your culture, is that something that's changing?
You think about what we do for a living, and we're full of dichotomies. On the one hand, space is hard. It's inherently risky. Our first satellite blew up. So we're willing at a very macro scale to do things that are inherently risky. On the other hand, we're literally rocket scientists, and we're culturally ingrained to do things in a very precise way. We have to launch a rocket into a little tiny hole that's been described as throwing a football through a tire from 7 football fields away. You don't screw that up. You don't take chances. It's a process where risk has been driven out. And so as we've moved into this new world, the first thing we did was move into big data analytics, and we ran into kind of the problem that Simon just talked about, where there was no consequence. So we started this up, spent money on it, had customers. For the first couple of years, we had really no idea, were we making money? Were we not making money? Is it profitable? If we scale it up, are we going to lose money? Or it was inherently not risky either. So what we've seen is a couple of things as we've moved into scaled Agile. We are breaking things down into MVPs, and so we have very quick feedback on something, and that's breaking down it takes 4 years to build a system into it. You have to show evidence in a quarter that you're actually doing something. And now as we're moving into AWS, we have these business opportunities, and the business owners themselves, the product line managers, have the opportunity to basically roll the dice, because they are the ones that are going to be putting their money on the table in terms of budget, that operating expense budget, to find out whether the market's going to be responsive to it. And they can spend as little as they want or as much as they want to go as incremental as they want or as big as they want. And so that is going to be the big game changer in terms of our approach, because it's that real-time feedback. It's going from annual budget cycles to compound weekly growth rates and things like that, where you are looking in fairly real time at success or failure, and you're failing fast, you're adjusting, inspecting and adjusting and moving forward. And so I think that's going to be the thing that I'm already starting in some of the parts of the business to see the culture change on.
So there's a couple of technology issues that have been implied by the last part of the conversation I want to bring to the forefront and have you further comment on. One is the idea of a data lake, the idea that if you have a storage platform where you can really put a bunch of well-designed data artifacts that are accessible by multiple teams, multiple tools, et cetera, then you really have driven down the cost of innovation a lot, because you don't have to do the whole data architecture every single time. Instead, you essentially are freeing people to work in individual teams against a common data set. And that includes both internal teams, like I think the Fender model primarily would be a bunch of internal teams. In your case, it could be external companies and collaborators who are not part of your organization, but who have controlled access to your rich data sets. And a related point is service-oriented architecture. I mean, we've been talking about it as an industry for 20 years, right? The idea of these lightweight services that all interact and can evolve separately, et cetera. But it's only, I think, in the last few years that people have really started to succeed with the service-oriented architectures. We don't even call it that anymore. We call it microservices or whatever. So does that resonate with you? Do you see those do you have those experiences? Maybe, Jay, you could start with some thoughts on that.
Well, I think we are starting to see that, and the thing that's really interesting for us in terms of managing data is it is sort of the key asset from which everything builds. And so pulling cost out of that, which is something that I'm just particularly personally geeky about, is really interesting, and it's a huge enabler. I think for this audience, a public sector audience, it's also important. I look at Amazon's different environments, ranging from commercial to C2S, as continuums, not as separate things. Mm-hmm. And our customers still, our public sector customers still see them as different things. And so what we're trying to drive, and again in partnership with Amazon, is this thought that, look, you're doing potentially classified work using unclassified material. It costs more over there. Let us manage it, and let us drive the cost out, and let us drive the innovation into that, and pass that along to you, because then it opens up more opportunities itself for those customers, and it becomes almost a cost multiplying network effect. And so we're trying to drive that now and really drive that out. And it's a very Amazon-like model, I think, in terms of, well, if we can drive price out, we can, or drive cost out, we can drive price down. If we drive price down, you can do more. If you do more, it will lead to more. And
the virtuous circle, or the
much.
flywheel effect, as Andy Jassy likes to say.
Yeah.
Similar experiences with the data lake model and microservices?
Sure. It's for us, and the data lake, because of the analytic nature of what we do, the concept of the data lake was from the get-go. That was part of it, and we developed this and took a very particular approach to it, which as we talk to organizations that are interested in going to AWS and doing analytics and big data on AWS, they're interested in. So now we're working with other organizations to provide services to help them get there with this. And specifically, it is that we separated two different concepts very clearly. One was the management of the data, and the other one was the querying and analytics on the data. Now, if those of us who came primarily from a relational database background, I won't name the vendors, through the 80s and 90s and so on, especially in the 90s and later, data querying and data management have been really one and the same thing. So when you go from one thing to another, it's a big lift to switch platforms. The reality of the world today is that data querying innovation is happening very rapidly. So where we had Hadoop, then we had Hive, we have Hive on Tez, we have Spark, we have Presto, we have there's Redshift, there's many HBase, and so forth. And this is going to continue to innovate, and is driven by internet scale data volumes. Data management, on the other hand, is a different story. That stuff needs to live and has a lifetime measured in tens of years. So we developed an architecture and approach that we've implemented for ourselves, and now, as I said, we're doing other places for people that are interested in this, is separating the data management from the data querying. And that's key. So against our data lake...
And ingest is almost a third bit.
And ingest certainly is a third bit, ingest normalization, data validation, and so on. But the key here is the data management needs to have lineage, versioning, all of that kind of stuff, part of it. These things, so against the data lake that we run for market regulation purposes, we have HBase going against it, we have Presto, we have Hive, we have Spark, we have Redshift, we have a multitude of these things depending on what's right for the job. And as new things come out, we retire the more old-fashioned ones that are less efficient. And we have data scientists going against it, doing machine learning and notebooks against the same data set. So the extracts happen, they do whatever it is that they're going to do, and so on. And I think that is a key concept, really, because the enterprise's knowledge and the thing that costs money to move from one generation to the next, to separate that from, so you can leverage the market innovations. And then by doing that, then it allows us to be very nimble to the business and give them new things. So, when the latest Spark-based data science notebooks come out, they're on it. And we do a quick proof of concept. Does it work? Do we want to use it? And they're off using it without having to do big migrations of the sort that's all risk-oriented and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So get your questions ready. We're about to move into a question from the audience phase, but I wanted to just briefly touch on that one other theme that I mentioned at the beginning, which is working with AWS as a partner and our innovation being driven by customer needs. I mean, I think snowmobile may be the emblematic, the sort of monumental example of that. I think, does everybody know what snowmobile is? You've seen the 18-wheel truck, carrying 100 petabytes of data. And Digital Globe was actually the first customer of that innovation and was a major factor in the realization that the little ones we were sitting at were not going to do the job for some of our customers. So that's maybe one example. But what other thoughts, Jay, have you had? What are your experiences in terms of being able to work with AWS as a partner?
Well, I think AWS is, an intensely customer-focused organization that really listens. And that's been apparent in my history across multiple companies and working with various teams. I think you see it in big things like the snowmobile or snowballs that, I don't think a whole lot of companies would actually think about something like that, much less actually have the audacity to do it. And so, but data movement is actually a big problem, as the handful of you or the half of you that said you're just sort of cloud curious. As you start to go into this, you might find that that's one of your first barriers, is just sort of that almost literal forklift upgrade into a place where you can start taking advantage of everything we've been working on. But it's also the smaller things. We're obviously very data focused, particularly at this stage. And a couple of the things that we've seen as innovations from Amazon haven't been technical, they've been pricing. So things as mundane as expedited retrieval out of Glacier, is a response to, hey, we've got all this data in Glacier, and guess what? Sometimes that information becomes interesting. We need to pull it out and we need to do something with it. It's not just archival storage. Enough customers said that AWS created a pricing model for it. And it's those things where there's a lot of listening going on. Seeing the focus that AWS has now on scale, on enterprise management of these environments at scale is really gratifying as well. There's the things that are simple when you have a handful of accounts and feel really good because you're innovating very rapidly, start to become unwieldy at hundreds, or for some of you, maybe thousands of accounts or users or VPCs or something like that. And so AWS is listening and looking at that and really putting a lot of effort into making that something that gives us, as the stewards, the custodians of the company's assets, great insight into where those are, how they're secure, what the access patterns are, optimizations, things like that. And that's what I've really seen and appreciated from AWS.
Good. How's the FINRA experience been?
Well,
you and I can both tell some stories about that.
No. It's been very positive. I mean, it's this isn't my first rodeo, and it's been no Snickers. If I let it grow out, it would be gray. It's been better than anything I would have imagined at the beginning. It's been a great, and you touched on it, which several times. The biggest kind of driving aspect of it has been that AWS hasn't been ideologically driven, which with a lot of, nobody calls it that, but when you deal with different vendors, it's this is the way we do things. This is our corporate architecture. This is our and this is, I'm sorry, you don't fit into that. And maybe that's partially, I've spent some time wondering about this, is what accounts for the widening gap between the AWS's functionality and the rest of the pack in the cloud world. And I think this is my explanation of it to myself, is the part of it is that you're not looking over your shoulder wondering what others are doing. Mm-hmm. You're looking to see what the customer wants. And that creates a forward propulsion there. And it's a reality. It's that as a customer, I see it, because we'll be in meetings, staff in meetings with AWS folks, and and it's a meeting, and all the various important people from AWS are there, and we're talking about something. So, well, this is what we suggest, right? And then some guy from the back says, a very junior person from AWS might say, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Everybody's quiet. What do you mean? And I said, well, because this, and this. And suddenly, hey, that's a good idea. And everybody's on that. And the environment that, as a customer I'm interacting with, I know that I'm getting the mental horsepower of everyone who's in that meeting and not a predetermined canned line of trying to fit. And that leads to all kinds of innovative potentials. I mean, when we did HBase on S3 together, that was I said, why would you ever want that? Well, here's why. Well, that makes sense. Let's do it. Now it turns out other people want it too, and it's a GA'd product for this particular analytics system with HBase being able to run it in multiple data availability AZs. Again, so I've seen that repeatedly, and it sounded, when people say customer centric, it sounds a bit apple pie-ish, but when you see it in action and not being redirected to something that you don't want, but instead, well, what is it you want and how do we solve that? That makes a huge difference.
That's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I've experienced that myself as an Amazon employee, of this willingness to think out, it's a cliche, but think outside the box, or hey, we've always done things a certain way, but why can't we do them a different way? Or even, product strategies. Well, hey, I could do this with Spark. I could do it with Redshift. That's okay. Take your choice. We're not going to religiously say this is the only and preferred way to do big data analytics. We'll get the best from the open source community. We'll develop some cool things that we think are important and valuable. And in fact, the overlap increases over time. Now, some people think that's confusing. And so just to be frank, some people say, hey, I want more kind of guided direction from you. And as in our architectural teams, we're willing to do that. We're willing to say, we think this is the best way to do it. But we're never going to say, that beyond when we're asked to say that, and we're always going to be very open to different approaches and optimizing.
The experience from our perspective has been one which, like I say, is not being pigeonholed and directed, and a company that's innovating to what our needs are. Now I realize that they're leveraged over other customers too, but that changes the whole thing.
Yeah.
It changes the dynamic.
Yeah, I think we've had the opportunity, obviously, to work with you on some very early stage products, and I always come out of those with the feeling that you're learning as much from us as we're learning from you, which is really important.
And great customers like this is a big part of our success is being able to listen and respond to those needs, and to have customers that both we enjoy working together, but they're tough on us. Like they don't take no. They say, look, we got to get this done. We got to do it a certain way. And those type of requirements we get from our customers are just incredibly valuable. And we're able to do our best to respond to that. So we've got some time left for audience questions. I hope I didn't chew up too much time here, but we'll be happy to, please.
Hi, I'm Kathy Conrad with Accenture. And I'd love to take this concept of customer centricity out a level. So how do you make your customers aware and get their input on what you can do with the on-demand data and analytics that you now have available from having made this shift?
The question is directed to us? Right. So how do we help our customers know what they can do with all this on-demand?
Or what you can do for them.
For them, yeah, right. So one of the things that we've done with the on-demand, I'm going to give you a particular illustration of something, the before and the after, and I think it fills in that, is in the past, before cloud and all this stuff, often we would have users that would want a particular data mart stood up for a particular analytics purpose. So it's a mini project, right? So people have to go, they have to find the data, some of it is here, some of it's there, some of it's there. And some of it might be on tape, bring it all in, stage it in, set up a cluster for it, provision the database space and the analytics space, copy, load it, and it's some number of weeks to do this kind of thing, 3, 6, whatever it is. It might be longer if it's a huge data set. So what we developed as part of this, and again, with this view of getting technologists out of the day-to-day line of doing business, of the business processes. So we don't want our technology people running around assembling these data marts, is the business user there goes to a query screen. There's various dimensions of the data. I want this slice specified in this way along these dimensions. Presses a button, and an ETL job kicks off in the background. It takes data out of the managed data lake in S3, transforms it, provisions a Redshift cluster, copies the data over to it, sends the user a link saying, here's your database, it's ready, and now they can go at it. So what we've done is, and I mean, this has kind of been one of the promises of data analytics for so many years, has been this taking out the intermediation of the technology group. And now they have direct access to it. So they can have direct access with an application we've developed that gives them spreadsheet-style functionality with 1 billion rows that can do pivots. Well, it's pretty serious, 1 billion rows of pivots. Or they can go at it with a data science notebook and do machine learning and various data science kinds of activities. But so what happens there then is that that unintermediated access to the data is giving the user community, prompting them to do things with the data that they would never have done before, because before you had to have a good reason to get a data mart. And it better be one, because there's some people, people are gonna go work on this, and they can only set up so many data marts a month. So now, just because you want to, you can have one, I mean, and the costs are minimal and tracked and so forth, and then you can go and see what's going on in the data.
So that drives innovation up to the next level.
So it increases the knowledge of the data, and in that world of analytics, I mean, that's where innovation comes in, is through a sense of the data and knowledge of it in an intuitive sense, a quantitative sense, and all of those types of things. So that's the way that's opened up.
Yeah,
Jay, do you see that kind of innovation chain of kind of going up?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I see a lot of potential, but the question is very insightful. You know, now that you've got this great capability, how do you actually get that out so your customers understand that they can take advantage of it? The approach we've taken was one of the most important events for us this year, and this is an IT guy saying this, is our global sales conference, where we could go out and actually train our sales force, our internal sales force, and our partners that, hey, the data's there. Go do these things. Change the conversation with your customers. You know, and for us, it's you know, we do still have agency customers who are, you know, it's contract vehicles and a timeline that's you know, you try to put your best innovation ideas into the response to you know, what they want. But a lot of our customers are non-governmental agencies that are trying to eradicate polio or are responding to rainforest deforestation, things like that. And you know, the conversation can now change from, well, we can do this for you. How about if I take that back and we'll have a conversation, we'll come back to you with a response, and you know, maybe in a couple of months we'll have something to market for you, to now it's hey, what do you need to do? Let's actually try this here, because we can. You know, and I think we need more of that going on. And I think by you know, us internally focusing on our folks internally in the field, talking to our customers and helping them understand, then we create these advocates who can go out and, you know, we've always been very customer focused, I think, as a company, but we can go with these new tools and capabilities and go drive what used to be a request into a conversation and a solution.
There seems to be just a very rich, almost a fractal recurring theme under these, which is things that used to take people, time, processes are more and more something that can be automated, and that enables higher level human operations, creativity, innovation, because everything, the repetitive parts are now automated.
It's
and it goes up the chain, it goes up the value chain. So now it's to the end customer, and then they can do things to the people that they're suppliers to, one way or another, that are also more innovative. So
it's important, and I think it was one of the things that makes it really important not to take existing processes and just transfer them to the cloud.
Right.
Because then you're taking your existing inefficiencies, and these benefits won't come. And some of the cultural dimensions of corporate culture shifts, where people, well, what am I going to do? I'm the one who runs this process internally. Well, what am I going to do over there? Those are important things to address. Otherwise, it's easy to take those processes into the cloud.
And there is a theme that we don't have time to explore deeply, but it's very relevant, I think, to many of our government customers, which is workforce transformation. People's jobs have to change, and that can be scary, and people can think, I don't want to do this because I won't have a job anymore, quote unquote. Well, no, there's plenty of work to do. It's just going to be different than what you've done in the past.
There's plenty of work. There's, I mean, as you say, it's a whole other topic, but there's, and also what we found is that it's actually welcome because you get to learn all this good cloud stuff.
Well,
and
it's eventually
it's an updating of job skills, really,
Yeah.
that is often quite welcome, actually.
Another question or two. We're winding down here, but I think we can go a little over. Yep. We have a mic coming over to you.
Mikhail Lerich, NIH. You were talking about the risks. The problem with projects which you do in cloud, sometimes projects fail. And how do you go back to your customers, to your stakeholders, saying that, okay, this failed because I decided to do it in cloud?
So, let me just see if I understood the question. How do you go back to your customer and say, this failed because I decided to do it in the cloud?
You are predetermined to do everything in AWS, let's say, and you decide, okay, this is the way I want to do that. But it might be cheaper to do it on-premise. It might be faster. It might be easier. It used to be easier. I mean, there are some examples, and it's just like the network latency doesn't let you do that, for example. And was there any project? Did you have any project when that which failed because of that decision? Basically,
take that as I'll take a half a step of a zoom out on that for a little bit of context around it. So the notion of a failure to come back, I mean, in our case, we haven't had, but it's a failure. What we tend to do is do an extensive, we'll do a proof of concept. I mean, will this work or not?
Right.
And when we first started doing things on AWS some years ago now, and now we're probably on our third or fourth generation of system architectures now in AWS. But the first one, well, people wanted to, for example, have these EC2 nodes and treat them like they were like a colo facility, and just the same approach. And did that as part of a proof of concept. And in that process, they think, well, this is not the best way to do this. When you do design, if you want to get the benefits of using AWS, you would use EMR, have flexibility, so on and so forth, load balancing, elasticity, all these kinds of things. So as an example, so the POC proves out what the best approach is. Now, having said that, there are situations where some of the things that we do have real-time latency requirements. They're related to the way stock markets operate, and there's a real-time latency requirement to it, which can really only be met by co-locating the processing in the same data center as where the trading venue is. Mm-hmm. So that is clearly, and we just revisited it again a couple of months ago. And for that narrow thing, well, that's not appropriate because it has to be there. But either an analysis, an architectural session or two, or a simple proof of concept to test out the latencies proves that out. It's not a project that then goes, we're not going to go marching into this with this ideological thing of here's the approach. The proof of concept should flesh that out. But having said that, barring that, latency where it has to be very close to the trading for us and so that type of an application, we haven't seen anything in the broader analytics space. The architectures are different. The approaches are different. The way you would scale up is different that you would do in an in-house data center to take advantage of the resiliency and the flexibility. It's a different architecture, but we haven't seen things that are bad fits.
Yeah, I think for us,
other than some like narrow things like that?
for us, it's a conversation and it's a compromise. So while we have this intention to go to AWS, we, in regard to the satellite we launched, made a series of compromises. The first one was we built this new microservices architecture and ran it in-house. So it's on a cloud. It happens to be my cloud, and the latency end-to-end in that cloud is 6 milliseconds because the thing we did get was it doesn't have to be wire speed between two racks sitting next to each other. We at least were able to introduce that level of latency. That is a learning experience, and it is a comfort factor, and it reduces the fear, uncertainty, and doubt of something that is so totally brand new. The next step is really starting to expand that into more of a hybrid cloud architecture, and doing that in a very safe way, in the sense that we can bring up a service across multiple AZs in multiple regions, one mine and one AWS, and if the latency is an issue, then we can move it back. It's a very safe, inexpensive way to find out whether something's going to work. And again, it's something where we're working hand in glove with our customer on that, not imposing something on them. Just not a really well-known fact inside the company, but we're actually already doing that with one particular service in that architecture that is running in AWS, and nobody knows about it because the latency is just fine. And as we start to expose that, we'll feel more comfortable about doing more of it, and we'll be able to accelerate more and move ultimately into an environment where we're going into the elastic cloud as opposed to what I characterize internally as the inelastic cloud, to make sure people know they can't stay there forever. But it works. You can't just impose an idea on people and say, trust me, it'll be great, even if it is.
I think that's a great way to kind of sum up is that, I think for 80 to 90% of IT needs, the cloud is going to do a great job for. There'll always be edge cases, there'll always be scenarios where cloud is not the right answer. And we totally understand that. We'll work with customers to optimize that. We have this thing we've talked about, which is multicast. There are a bunch of data feeds you get from the financial services industry that are UDP packets, and that's the way they're delivered. And they're not delivered over the internet, of course, because multicast is not very reliable over the internet. So they're delivered through private networks. So we've talked about it. How do we do that? Do we enable multicast, which has its challenges in virtual networks? Do we turn that into Kinesis Stream, which seems to me like a more long-term sustainable architecture? So we're going to work through those design patterns. But in the meantime, you have to create some kind of a gateway if you want that type of technological experience in cloud. So one real last comment. I finally watched a video that I'd heard about a long time. I strongly recommend people watch it. It's a video by Zynga, the most famous customer to ever exit AWS and then come back. And they gave a presentation on that experience at reInvent, I think about a year and a half ago. Incredibly interesting, highly recommended. I won't say any more than that. Thank you so much for your time. We'll hang around for a while and take more questions. Appreciate you being here, and I hope the rest of your conference goes really well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.